The darkness inside the convent infirmary held the particular stillness that comes only in the deepest part of night, hours after compline and long before the first bell for lauds. In the long, low room, stone walls thick with centuries of silence pressed inward, holding the faint mingled scents of dried lavender, beeswax from the candle stubs on the small altar, and the clean, coarse linen of bedclothes. A single red ember glowed in the iron brazier set in the middle of the floor, its warmth barely reaching the corners where the cot stood in quiet rows. Above, the heavy oak beams of the ceiling were invisible in the blackness, but their presence could almost be felt, like a weight of safety overhead. Nothing stirred except the slow, fragile breathing of the patients and the soft turning of a woman in her sleep. Sister Aelwen woke without alarm or urgency. Her eyes opened in the small adjoining cell, and she lay for a moment on her narrow pallet, listening to the familiar pattern of night sounds, a faint creak from the roof timbers, the distant hoot of an owl somewhere down in the valley, the rustle of the coarse wool blanket as she shifted. The air was cold on her face, cold enough that she could feel the chill along her cheekbones, and she knew without looking that the stone floor would be icy underfoot. For a long minute she simply remained still, gathering her thoughts like seeds dropped one by one into a pouch, unhurried. Then she sat up, her joints speaking in small quiet complaints about the hour and the chill, and reached for her day tunic of undyed wool hanging on the wooden peg beside the bed. Dressing was a slow ritual without any wasted motion. First the shift of linen, warm soft by countless washings, then the heavy tunic, then the wide sleeves that she tied at the wrists with a single loop of cord. Over her head she settled the linen coif, its white fabric clean and cool, tucking away the grey-streaked hair that had once been dark brown, and now was mostly silver in the daylight. Her hands, knotted at the knuckles from years of grinding herbs and wringing cloths, worked with a gentle certainty. She pulled on thick wool stockings and stepped into her sandals, the leather soles pressing flat against the packed dirt and stone of the floor. There was no mirror, no need for one. She knew her own face well enough, the lines around her mouth from a lifetime of quiet smiles, the soft, hooded eyes that had seen more than 60 summers in the Welsh hills. The door to the infirmary proper stood slightly ajar, and she pushed it open with the flat of her palm, the wood cool and smooth as a river stone. Inside the long room, the darkness had begun to soften almost imperceptibly, the high narrow windows showing a blue-grey hint of the coming dawn. Sister Aelwen moved first to the brazier, where she added a single handful of charcoal from the bucket nearby, nudging the embers with the iron poker until a small new flame licked up, casting enough light to outline the shapes in the room. The cots, 7 of them in 2 rows with a wide aisle between, held the sleeping forms of the convent, sick and aged. Each cot was a simple wooden frame with rope netting and a straw-filled mattress, covered in clean linen sheets and wool blankets of the same undyed brown as her tunic. She began her morning round, not with checking the remedies or the charts, for there were no written charts, but simply by walking to the first cot and looking down at the face of the old woman who lay there. This was the infirmarian's oldest patient, a widow named Gwen, who had come to the convent in her later years after outliving all her kin in a fever outbreak long ago. Her breathing had a slight rattle, a faint bubbling at the back of her throat that Sister Aelwen knew well. It was the breathing of a heart that laboured like a tired horse on a long, slow hill. The herbalist bent close, her hand hovering just above the old woman's forehead, not quite touching, feeling the warmth radiating upward. No fever, just the steady heat of sleep. The woman's face was slack and peaceful, the deep lines around her mouth softer in rest. Sister Aelwen straightened the edge of the blanket where it had slipped from the bony shoulder, tucking it with a movement so light it did not disturb the sleeper. In the next cot, a young lay sister named Margaret lay curled on her side, one arm thrown over her face. She had come to the infirmary 3 days before with a sharp cough and a flushed cheek, and now the cough had loosened and the fever had broken, leaving behind only a heavy tiredness. Sister Aelwen listened to the young woman's breathing, clear and unobstructed like water running over smooth pebbles, and allowed herself a small inward nod. The girl would be up and back to her duties soon, scrubbing pots in the kitchen or helping with the mending. She would miss the quiet company of her in the infirmary, though she would never say so aloud. The third cot held old Brother Cadfan, the convent's only male patient. An ancient man who had once been a shepherd on the high pastures and now rarely spoke but hummed sometimes in his sleep, a tuneless drone that the sisters had grown used to. His blanket had slipped down entirely, and Sister Aelwen pulled it up over his thin chest, feeling the ridge of each rib beneath the wool. He did not stir. The fourth cot was empty, its mattress rolled, and the ropes waiting for their next burden. The fifth held a middle-aged sister who suffered from swelling in her legs, her feet propped on a folded blanket, and she was breathing easily. The sixth cot held a visitor, a merchant's wife from the market town beyond the ridge who had been taken ill while travelling and had been given shelter. She snored softly, a sound like the distant purring of a cat. The seventh cot, the one nearest the door, was empty as well. This slow progress from bed to bed was the same every morning, a path so well worn in Sister Aelwen's mind that her feet knew the way without her eyes needing to guide them. She did not think of it as a task or a duty, but simply as the shape of the early hours, like the way the stream in the valley curved around the alder trees, or the way the swallows returned to the same eaves each spring. There was no urgency in any of it, no sense of hurry or delay. The patients slept, and she watched over them, and that was the natural order. When she had finished her circuit, she crossed to the far end of the infirmary, where a heavy oak cupboard stood against the wall, its doors carved with simple interlocking circles that had worn shallow with age. Inside, rows of pottery jars and small stoppered bottles lined 3 shelves, each labelled with a scrap of parchment written in her own careful hand. The labels were faded, but she knew their contents by the shape of the jars. Chamomile in the fat round one, dried yarrow in the tall narrow one, crushed elderberry in the square jar with the chipped rim, powdered willow bark in the clay pot sealed with wax. The air inside the cupboard was a concentrated version of the infirmary's scent, an earthiness of dried plants and the faint, sweet sharpness of old honey. Her eyes moved to the jar on the middle shelf, the one made of greenish glass that had come from a glassmaker far to the south many years ago. Inside, the remains of last season's foxglove leaves lay in a thin layer at the bottom, barely enough to cover the curve of the glass. The leaves were dry as old parchment, grey-green and brittle, and when she lifted the jar and tilted it gently, they rustled like tiny dry wings. There was perhaps enough for 2 more doses of the heart tonic, the mixture of powdered leaf and honey and warmed wine that she prepared for old Gwen each evening. After that, the jar would be empty. The new leaves would not be fully dried and cured for at least a fortnight, and the old supply was nearly exhausted. She set the jar back on the shelf, without any change in her expression. Worry was not a habit she had ever cultivated. Where other people might have felt a prick of anxiety at the low supply, Sister Aelwen simply noted the fact and made a plan as calmly as noting that water must be fetched from the well. The foxglove grew in a small clearing in the valley, a place she knew as well as her own cell, and the morning would be fine for gathering. She would go before the sun grew too high, when the leaves were still crisp with dew and the stalks had not yet begun to droop in the heat. There was time, always time. From the cupboard she took also a small account of the other supplies that were running low, turning the jars in her hands and feeling their weight. The dried mint was half gone. She would gather more when she passed the stream where it grew wild among the watercress. The jar of poppy syrup was full, the honey pot heavy and waxy, the flasks of rose water and distilled angelica nearly untouched. Everything was in order, everything in its place, and the low foxglove was simply the next thing to attend to. She closed the cupboard doors softly, the old hinges making a sound like a sighed breath, and crossed the room to an alcove near the brazier, where she kept her gathering things. The wicker basket hung on a hook, its handle worn dark from the grip of many walks to the valley. She lifted it down and inspected it briefly, running her thumb along the weave to check for any broken strand that might widen into a hole. But the basket was sound, its willow ribs still tight and strong. She set it on the wooden bench and began to prepare for the morning's walk. Into the basket went a square of clean linen cloth, folded twice, that she would spread on the ground to kneel upon while she worked. Beside it she placed the small curved knife with its wooden handle polished smooth by her palm, the blade kept sharp and wiped with oil, wrapped in its own scrap of leather. From a shelf near the door she took the flask she used for walking, a pear-shaped bottle of thick green glass stopped with a cork, and filled it from the ewer of watered ale that the kitchen always kept cool in the passageway. The liquid was pale brown and smelled faintly of bread and a distant tang of fermentation, and it would taste pleasantly sour after the walk. The kitchen was a separate building across a small cobbled yard, and the passageway where the ewer stood was chilly and dark, smelling of cold ashes and the clean mineral scent of the stone flags. Sister Aelwen walked there in her sandals, the leather straps dampening in the dew that had settled on the stones. No one else was awake. The kitchen fire would not be lit until the lay sisters rose for the day's first meal. She filled the flask, stoppered it, and tucked it into the basket where it settled with a soft clink against the knife handle. When she returned to the infirmary, the young lay sister Margaret had stirred in her cot. She opened her eyes, still clouded with sleep, and whispered a question that was half lost in a yawn. Sister Aelwen leaned close and said a few words in a voice that was barely above the rustle of straw ticking, telling her to sleep, that she was merely going to the valley for leaves and would return before sext. The girl nodded, her eyes already closing again, and burrowed deeper into her pillow. The old woman Gwen did not wake, nor did Brother Cadfan, nor any of the others. The room was quiet once more. The bell for Lords would not ring for nearly another hour, and Sister Aelwen preferred the walk in the earliest part of the day, when the light was still grey and the birds were just beginning their first tentative calls. She slipped out of the infirmary door, which opened onto a small cloister garden of herbs and a few roses that grew against the sun-warmed south wall. The garden was silver with dew, every leaf of sage and hyssop glinting with tiny droplets that soaked the hem of her tunic as she passed. The air outside was cool and still, carrying the green smell of the valley below and the faintest trace of wood smoke from the kitchen chimney of a cottage far down the slope where a shepherd's wife would also be rising to start her day. The convent sat low on the shoulder of a hill, its grey stone walls blending into the landscape as if they had grown there from the rock itself. Below it, the valley opened out in a wide, gentle bowl, lined with patchworks of small fields, strips of woodland, and the silver thread of the stream winding through the bottom. Mist lay in the hollows, pooling like milk in the dips of the land, and the far ridge was just beginning to be outlined against a sky that shaded from deep charcoal overhead to a soft pearl at the horizon. Nothing moved in the valley that she could see, no figures, no animals, just the slow drift of the mist and the distant dark shapes of trees. Sister Aelwen stood for a moment at the low gate that led from the cloister onto the path down into the valley. She settled the basket in the crook of her arm and felt its familiar weight, the flask and the knife, and the folded cloth all secure. Her sandals were damp, her coif cool against her temples, her breath a faint wisp of white in the chill air. Then she pushed the gate open and stepped through, and the heavy oak door of the infirmary swung shut behind her with a soft and final thud, leaving the sleeping patients and the warm glow of the brazier to wait until she returned. The gate closed behind her with the soft click of the iron latch falling into its cradle, a sound so familiar that she did not turn her head. Beyond the convent wall, the path began at once, a ribbon of beaten earth and sparse grass that wound downward from the shoulder of the hill into the valley below. The ground underfoot was still damp with the night's dew, not muddy, but softened, and her sandals left shallow prints that would fade as the sun rose and dried the grass. The air outside the cloister carried a different quality, cooler and wider, no longer held close by stone walls but moving freely across the open slope with a faint breath of movement that stirred the fine hairs at her temples where the coif did not cover them. Sister Aelwen walked slowly, not from any infirmity of age, but from a settled preference for a pace that allowed the world to present itself in detail. The path descended gently at first, skirting a small outcrop of grey rock where lichen grew in patches of silver green and rust orange, spreading in slow circles over the stone-like maps of unknown countries drawn by a patient hand. She passed this outcrop every morning that she walked to the valley, and each time she noticed the same things, the particular curve of the stone where it bulged outward, the crack running diagonally across its face where a sapling ash had once taken root and then died, leaving only a dry twist of wood wedged in the fissure. These small constancies were a comfort, a quiet reminder that the world held its shape. Beyond the outcrop the path levelled slightly and entered the first fringe of the valley wood. Here the trees began, not a dense forest but an open woodland of hazel and alder, with an occasional oak, standing broad and solitary, in a small clearing of its own making. The leaves of the hazels were still young, only a few weeks unfurled from their buds, and they hung in soft green tiers that trembled with the faintest movement of air. The alders grew closer to the stream, which she could now hear as a distant murmur off to her left, a sound so steady and low that it was almost more a feeling in the ground than a noise in the air. The bark of the alders was dark and rough, fissured into vertical ridges that caught the grey morning light in thin lines of silver. The path through the wood was narrower here, barely wide enough for two people to walk abreast, and it followed the contour of the hillside in a long, easy traverse that avoided the steeper drops into the valley bottom. Sister Aelwen knew every turn of this path, every place where a root crossed the way or a stone jutted up from the packed earth. Her feet found the level ground without her eyes needing to search for it, stepping automatically over a tangle of exposed alder roots at the base of an old tree, skirting a patch of mud that never fully dried, even in high summer, because a small spring seeped from the bank above it. The mud was the same dark brown as the soil throughout the valley, rich with rotted leaves and smelling faintly of iron and wet wood. The birds had been silent when she first stepped out from the cloister, but now, 100 paces into the wood, the first tentative notes of the dawn chorus began to emerge. A blackbird, hidden somewhere in the canopy of an oak, started with 3 liquid notes that rose and fell like water dropping into a deep pool, then paused as if considering, then repeated the phrase with a slight variation at the end. The sound was clear and unhurried, not yet the full chorus that would come with the sunrise, with a single voice testing the stillness. Somewhere further down the valley, a wood pigeon added its low cooing, a sound of 5 syllables that repeated at measured intervals like the slow tolling of a distant bell. And from the far ridge, so faint that it might have been memory rather than hearing, came the call of a cuckoo, its 2 notes dropping in pitch from the first to the second. Sister Aelwen walked under these sounds as under a roof of gentle music, her own footsteps making no sound at all on the soft path. The light had shifted since she left the convent. Looking up through the branches, she could see that the sky had paled from charcoal to a luminous grey, the colour of a pearl held in shadow, with a thin wash of shell pink beginning to spread along the eastern horizon where the sun would soon crest the ridge. The mist that had pooled in the valley bottom was beginning to thin, pulling apart into wisps that clung to the tops of the alders and drifted slowly across the stream. Everything was damp, everything was still, and the world seemed to be holding its breath in the long pause between night and day. At a bend in the path where a large flat stone had been set as a stepping place across a small rivulet, Sister Aelwen paused. She did not set down her basket or sit on the stone, but simply stopped walking and stood, letting the stillness of the wood settle around her. The rivulet was no wider than her arm, a thread of clear water that trickled down from a spring somewhere up the slope and crossed the path before running down to join the main stream. It made a tiny sound, a delicate glassy trickle that was barely audible under the blackbird's song. She watched the water for a moment, noting how it flowed around a small stone and carried a single fallen hazel leaf in a slow spiral. The leaf was yellow-green, newly fallen, and it turned in the tiny eddy with a motion like a hand slowly opening and closing. Then she stepped over the rivulet, setting her foot on the flat stone, and then onto the soft ground beyond, and continued along the path. The way now began to slope more steeply downward, and the trees opened slightly to reveal a glimpse of the valley proper. Through a gap in the hazels she could see the pattern of small fields laid out below, their boundaries marked by dry stone walls that ran in straight lines and gentle curves across the contours of the land. The walls were the same grey stone as the convent, and had been built long ago by hands that were now forgotten, yet the walls remained, holding the shapes of the fields against the slow erosion of time. Some of the fields still showed the faint ridges of old ploughing, though they had not been cultivated for many years, and now grew only grass and wildflowers. In one field, a single cow stood motionless, its breath a small cloud of white that dissipated slowly into the air. Sister Aelwen did not stop to look at the view, but she allowed it to enter her awareness as she walked, the way the shape of the valley was simply present, like the sound of the stream or the weight of the basket on her arm. The path now brought her closer to the stream, and the murmur grew into a clearer voice, a steady rushing that was not loud but constant, made of many small sounds as the water moved over stones and around the roots of alders that grew right at the water's edge. The stream was not deep, only knee-high in most places, and the water ran clear over a bed of smooth grey pebbles and occasional slabs of flat rock. Watercress grew in thick green mats along the edges, and the air near the stream was noticeably cooler, carrying a clean mineral scent. She followed the path now as it ran parallel to the stream for a short distance, the ground underfoot turning slightly stonier as the soil thinned and the underlying rock showed through in pale ridges. Here and there a fern had found a foothold in a crack, its fronds unfurling into delicate green lace that trembled with the vibration of the water. A dipper, small and dark with a white throat, bobbed on a stone in mid-stream, its body moving up and down in the characteristic motion that gave the bird its name. Sister Aelwen glanced at it without breaking her stride, and the bird, unalarmed, continued its bobbing as she passed. The path curved away from the stream now and climbed slightly over a low hummock where an old oak had fallen many years ago and now lay half buried in the earth, its trunk thick with moss and its bark peeling away in long strips. The moss on the fallen log was a vivid green, soft as the finest velvet, and dotted with tiny spore capsules that rose on hair-thin stems and swayed in the faintest breath of wind. Sister Aelwen reached down as she passed and touched the moss with her fingertips, feeling the cool, springy texture, the infinitesimal give of the tiny leaves beneath her touch. Her fingers came away damp and smelling of green growing things. Beyond the hummock, the path forked. The right-hand branch led down to the stream crossing and eventually to the track that went deeper into the valley toward the scattered cottages of the tenant farmers. The left-hand fork climbed gently up the side of a smaller side valley, a fold in the hills that was almost hidden from the main valley until you were right upon it. This was the way to the Foxglove clearing, and Sister Aelwen took the left fork without hesitation, her feet knowing the direction before her mind had registered the choice. The path here was narrower still, little more than a sheep track worn into the grass, and it rose between banks of bracken that were still tightly furled in their fiddlehead stage, their brown-green tips pushing up through the soil. The bracken smelled sharply green, a scent like crushed ferns, and it brushed against her tunic as she walked, leaving faint smears of moisture on the coarse wool. The side valley was smaller and more sheltered than the main valley, its slopes steeper and its floor narrower. The stream here was only a trickle, and the trees grew closer together, forming a canopy of hazel and hawthorn that dappled the path with shifting patterns of grey light. The blackbird's song faded behind her, replaced by the smaller sounds of this more confined space, the rustle of a shrew in the dry leaves beside the path, the distant tap of a woodpecker on a dead branch, the constant soft sifting of the breeze through the young hazel leaves. Everything was muted, everything was gentle. The path climbed at a slight angle, enough that Sister Aelwen felt the subtle pull in her calves, a pleasant awareness of exertion that was not strain. She slowed her pace a little, adjusting to the incline, her breathing steady and unhurried. Her sandals gripped the grass, and she placed each foot with care, avoiding the loose stones that might turn under her weight. The basket swung gently on her arm, and the flask inside gave a soft liquid clunk against the knife handle with each step. After perhaps 200 paces, the path opened out slightly, and she came to a small level area where someone long ago had built a rough bench of stones against the bank. It was not the Foxglove clearing yet, but a resting place that she used sometimes on hot days or when the basket was heavy on the return journey. Today, with the air still cool and her strength still fresh, she did not stop. She glanced at the stone bench, noting that a spider had woven a web across one corner, the silk beaded with dew and catching the light in a pattern of tiny rainbows. And then she walked on. The path made one more turn, a sharp bend around an outcropping of rock that jutted from the slope like the prow of a stone ship, and then suddenly the Foxglove clearing opened before her. It was not a dramatic reveal, no sudden vista or sweeping view, but simply a widening of the valley folded to a broad, flat shelf of land where the trees drew back and the sun, just now rising above the eastern ridge, poured its first full light into the sheltered space. The clearing was perhaps 50 paces across, bounded on the uphill side by a steep bracken-covered slope, and on the downhill side by an ancient dry stone wall that ran in a gentle curve along the contour of the ground. And there, standing tall and purple among the ferns and the creeping buttercups, the foxgloves grew in abundance. The first morning light caught the tips of their flowering spikes, turning the purple bells to a translucent rose that glowed against the shadowed green of the slope behind them. The spikes rose to the height of a person's shoulder, some as tall as her head, and each one held dozens of individual flowers, each flower a small hanging bell marked inside with spots of darker purple and white that guided the bees to the nectar within. The basal leaves, the ones she had come to gather, spread out at the base of each plant in broad rosettes of grey-green, their surfaces softly hairy and their edges finely toothed. The dew lay on them in a fine silver mist of droplets that had not yet dried in the new sun. Sister Aelwen stopped at the edge of the clearing and looked at the foxgloves. A bee was already at work, climbing into one of the purple bells and emerging with its legs dusted in pale pollen. The air here was warmer than on the path, sheltered from the breeze and holding the sun's heat against the stone of the old wall. The scent of the clearing was a mixture of damp earth, crushed grass, and a faint floral sweetness that came from the foxglove flowers themselves. The wall, which had once enclosed a catty pen long before the convent was built, was now half tumbled in places, its stones grey with lichen and tufted with cushions of stone crop and pennywort. But the line of it still held, a marker of human labour that had long since returned to the wild. She stepped into the clearing, her sandals pressing into the soft grass, and crossed to a level spot near the wall where the ground was dry and the grass grew short. She set down the basket, knelt on the grass, and opened it. The folded linen cloth came out first, and she spread it on the ground beside her, smoothing the wrinkles with her palm until it lay flat. Then she took out the small knife and unwrapped it from its leather sheath, laying the blade across the corner of the cloth. The flask of ale she set to one side against a stone of the wall where it would stay cool in the shade. Her preparations were complete, and the morning's work could begin. The light grew stronger, the bee continued its rounds, and the valley held its peace. The walk was over, and the gathering was about to start. The linen cloth lay smooth on the grass, its weave catching the low sunlight in a grid of tiny shadows. Sister Aelwen settled her weight onto her knees, feeling the give of the turf beneath the cloth, the slight coolness that seeped up from the soil even through the folded layers. The basket sat open at her right hand, the knife rested on the corner of the cloth, and before her the foxgloves rose in their dozens, their purple spires swaying with a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible, more a breathing than a swaying. The morning had grown fully light now, the sun clear of the eastern ridge and pouring down into the sheltered clearing with a warmth that she could feel on her shoulders through the wool of her tunic. She did not begin at once. For a long moment she simply looked at the plants, her eyes moving over the rosettes of basal leaves that spread out from the base of each flowering stalk. The leaves were what she had come for, and not all leaves were each had come for, and not all leaves were equal. The young plants of the first year, which sent up only leaves and no flower spike, were too tender, their chemistry not yet fully developed. The flowering plants held what she needed in their lowest leaves, the ones that spread in a circle at ground level, broad and grey-green with a slightly pebbled surface and a soft down of fine hairs. These basal leaves of the second-year plants contained the compounds that, dried and powdered and measured with exacting care, would steady a faltering heart. The leaves higher on the stalk, narrower and darker, were too strong and would be left alone. This knowledge lived in her hands as much as in her mind, a knowing that came from years of practice and a lineage of herbalists stretching back through the convent's records to the old women who had gathered these same leaves before the convent was even built. The first plant she chose grew apace to her left, its basal rosettes spreading wide and full across the grass, the leaves overlapping like the petals of a grey-green rose. She shifted her weight, moving the basket with her, and reached out to lift one of the outermost leaves. Her fingers closed on the stem where it met the central crown, and she examined the surface in the slanting light, turning it slightly. The leaf was unblemished, its edges a clean row of soft, rounded teeth, its color an even silvery sage without spots of brown or yellow. A good leaf. She released it gently and then took up the knife. The the wooden handle warm from its wrapping in the leather sheath. The cut was a small, precise motion, the blade sliding between the leaf stem and the crown, with a faint crisp sound that was more felt than heard. She severed 3 leaves from the first plant, each one chosen from a different part of the rosette so that the plant would not be stripped bare on one side, and laid them flat in the basket. The leaves were large, as broad as her palm and longer than her hand from wrist to fingertip, and they made a soft pile in the bottom of the basket, their grey-green surfaces catching the light. She did not press them down or stack them too thickly, knowing that bruised leaves would blacken and lose their virtue. Each leaf was laid gently against the next, like pages in a book that must not be folded. She moved to the next plant, a few inches to the right, and repeated the process. Reach, examine, cut, place. Her movements had no haste in them, no sense of a task to be completed quickly. Time in the clearing moved at its own pace, marked by the slow climb of the sun and the shifting of the shadows that the foxglove spires cast across the grass. A second bee joined the first, this one smaller and darker, and the two of them worked the flowers in a steady circuit, disappearing into the bells and emerging again as if the flowers were small rooms they were tidying. The humming of their wings was a low, continuous note that blended with the trickle of the stream below and the distant calling of the wood pigeon. Sister Aelwen worked her way slowly along the line of the old wall, moving sideways on her knees, the basket travelling with her in increments of a handspan at a time. She did not take from every plant. Some were too young, their basal leaves still small and pale, and she left these untouched with a small nod as if excusing them from duty. Others were too old, their lower leaves already yellowing at the edges, and these she passed by as well. The foxglove was generous in this clearing, and there was no need to be greedy or careless. The plants that had given their leaves would continue to flower and set seed, and next year their daughters would grow in the same spot. The pattern of her work was steady and repetitive, a rhythm that matched the rhythm of her breathing. She would lean forward, one hand bracing on the grass, the other reaching with the knife. Her eyes would examine the leaf, checking both surfaces for insects or disease. The blade would make its small, precise cut, and then the leaf would be lifted and placed. Every third or fourth plant, she paused to stretch her fingers, the knuckles giving a soft click, and then resumed. The pile of leaves in the basket grew slowly, layer upon layer of grey-green velvet. The sun climbed higher, and the quality of the light in the clearing changed. The early morning sharpness softened into the fuller gold of mid-morning, and the shadows lost their long stretching shapes and gathered closer to the bases of the plants. The dew dried on the grass, and the faint silver mist that the cool night had left in the air dissipated entirely, leaving a clarity that made every detail of the clearing stand out with gentle precision. The old wall, which at dawn had been merely a dark shape, now showed every lichen and every cushion of moss in its full colour. The grey stone warmed to a pale honey tone on the surfaces that faced the sun. A wren appeared on the wall, small and quick, its tail cocked upward at a sharp angle. It watched Sister Aelwen with one bright eye, its head turning in a series of tiny jerks, and then it vanished into a gap in the stones, where it had a nest hidden from sight. She saw it go and made no reaction beyond a faint softening at the corners of her mouth, a near smile that did not fully form. The birds had long since accepted her presence in the clearing, and the wren's brief inspection was simply part of the morning's quiet exchange of glances. When she had worked her way along perhaps half the length of the wall, she sat back on her heels and rested her hands on her thighs. The basket now held a modest layer of leaves, enough that their weight made the wicker give slightly when she lifted it. She estimated the yield with a practiced eye, calculating how many leaves would be needed to fill the green glass jar in the infirmary cupboard. How many would be lost to the shrinkage of drying? How many would be kept in reserve? The number arrived in her mind without conscious calculation, a knowing that was simply there, like knowing the weight of a full water bucket or the distance to the stream. She would need perhaps twice this many, but there was no need to hurry. She picked up her flask and drew the cork with a twist of her thumb. The watered ale was cool and faintly sour, washing the faint dust of the path from her throat, and she drank only 2 swallows before stopping it again and setting it back in its place by the wall-stone. A ladybird, red with 7 black spots, had landed on the rim of the basket and she watched it for a moment as it explored the edge of the wicker, its tiny legs moving with deliberate precision. Then it opened its wing cases and flew away, a small, bright vanishing. She returned to her work, moving now to a new section of the clearing, where the foxgloves grew a little closer together and the ground sloped slightly upward toward the bracken bank. The angle of the slope meant that she had to adjust her position, kneeling with one knee higher than the other, and the change in posture made her aware of the muscles in her lower back, a faint, pleasant ache that came from the morning's slow labor. She placed the basket on the uphill side so that it would not tip, anchoring it against a tuft of grass, and continued the steady harvest. The leaves in this part of the clearing were slightly different in character, the rosettes growing in a spot that caught more sun and less morning shade from the wall. The leaves were a shade lighter in color, more silver than gray, and their edges were slightly more deeply toothed, but they were healthy and full, and she worked among them with the same careful rhythm, her knife moving in its small arcs, her hands performing the motions that they had learned so long ago that they no longer required her attention. Her mind could drift, and it did, not to any particular thought, but to a state of quiet awareness that held the whole clearing at once: the warmth of the sun, the sound of the bees, the texture of the leaves, the smell of crushed grass and warm stone. A cloud passed over the sun, a single large cloud that she had not noticed approaching, and the clearing fell into sudden shadow. The change was immediate, the colors muting and the air cooling by a perceptible degree, and she looked up from her work for the first time in what felt like a long while. Her hands paused on a half-severed leaf, and she watched the shadow of the cloud move across the valley, a great dark shape, sliding over the fields and the stream and the ridge beyond. It would pass in a moment, and the sun would return, and she waited for it without impatience, feeling the brief coolness on her face. The wood pigeon fell silent during the shadow's passage, and then, as the light returned and the clearing bloomed again with gold, it resumed its measured cooing as if it had never stopped. Sister Aelwen finished cutting the leaf she had been holding and laid it in the basket. The pile was growing steadily, a soft mound of grey-green that now rose above the rim of the wicker. She pressed it down gently with her palm, feeling the springy resistance of the leaves, and judged that she had gathered enough. The basket was not full, and there was room for more, but she had learned long ago that it was better to take only what was needed and to leave the rest for another day. The foxgloves would still be here next week and the week after, and the dried leaves kept well in the sealed jar. She wiped the blade of her knife on the linen cloth, removing a smear of green sap, and wrapped it again in its leather sheath, before placing it in the basket. Then she stretched her arms above her head, feeling the pull across her shoulders and the slight shift of the bones in her spine, a long, slow stretch that ended with her hands resting loosely in her lap. The clearing was quiet, the sun was warm, and the morning's work was done. The knife was wrapped and put away, the basket settled in the shade of the old wall, and the morning's work lay behind her like a completed stitch in a longer piece of cloth. Sister Aelwen did not rise at once from her knees, but stayed where she was, her hands resting loosely in her lap, the knuckles still faintly dusted with the silvery residue that the foxglove leaves left on the skin. The sun had climbed well above the ridge now and poured its warmth into the sheltered fold of the clearing, with a steadiness that felt almost like a hand laid gently on the shoulder. The stones of the old wall, which had been cool to the touch when she first knelt down, were now warm where the light fell directly on them, their grey surfaces holding the heat and releasing it slowly into the air with a faint dry scent of warmed rock and old lichen. She turned herself around slowly, shifting her knees on the linen cloth, and sat back against the wall with her spine finding the natural hollows and bumps of the stones through the wool of her tunic. The wall curved behind her in a gentle arc, the shape of the old cattle pen still readable in the landscape, after who knew how many generations of grass and bracken had grown and died around it. Some of the stones had shifted over the years, their edges rounded by rain and frost, and a few had tumbled out entirely, leaving gaps where cushions of stone crop spread their fleshy leaves and sent up small starry flowers of bright yellow. She settled into one of the hollows where a larger stone had once sat, the space now making a kind of shallow seat that fit the curve of her back. The warmth of the sun was on her face and her hands, and the slight breeze that moved through the clearing was just enough to stir the fine hairs at her temples without bringing any chill. She reached for the flask, which still stood where she had left it against the wall stone, and drew the cork with the same twist of her thumb as before. The ale inside had warmed slightly in the sun, but it was still cool enough to be pleasant, and she drank slowly, letting each small mouthful sit on her tongue before swallowing. The liquid tasted of barley and the faint sour tang of fermentation, a clean and simple flavour that the kitchen sisters brewed every month in the great wooden vat that stood in the brew-house behind the bake-oven. She knew that vat well, had helped to scrub it with handfuls of coarse salt when she was younger and had more strength for such tasks, and the memory of the dark, cool brew-house with its smell of malt and whetstone passed through her mind without insistence, like a leaf drifting on still water. Along with the ale, she had brought a small piece of oat bread, wrapped in a scrap of clean linen, and she unfolded it now with the careful movements of someone who had learned not to waste crumbs. The bread was dense and slightly crumbly, made from oats grown on the convent's own small fields and ground in the mill down by the stream, the one with the great wooden wheel that turned so slowly in the summer months when the water ran low. It had been baked the previous afternoon, and it still held a hint of the oven's warmth in its texture, a slight give under her teeth that released the mild nutty flavour of the oats. She ate it in small bites, chewing slowly and looking out across the clearing without focusing on any particular thing. The buzzard had appeared while she was eating, rising on a thermal that the warming ground had sent up from the far side of the ridge. It was a broad-winged bird, dark against the pale sky, and it circled in a long, easy spiral that required no flap of its wings, only the slightest adjustment of its pinion feathers to hold the rising air. Sister Aelwen watched it with the quiet attention she gave to all the valley's creatures, following its path as it drifted higher, and then slanted away toward the open ground beyond the ridge where rabbits grazed in the short turf. The buzzard's cry came down to her, a thin mewing sound that seemed too small for such a large bird, and then it was gone over the hill and the sky was empty again. The wood pigeon had not ceased its cooing all morning, and now, in the stillness of her rest, she became aware of it again. The 5 soft syllables repeating at intervals that were as regular as the swinging of a censer. Somewhere closer, in the hazels at the edge of the clearing, a chiff-chaff had begun its own 2-note song, a sound like a small coin dropped repeatedly into a stone basin, and the combination of the pigeon's low drone and the chiff-chaff's bright ping made a kind of simple music that asked nothing of the listener. The bees continued their work among the foxglove bells, their humming a constant undertone that wove through the other sounds like a thread through plain cloth. Her thoughts drifted without direction, as they often did in these moments of rest that she carved out of the working day. She did not think about the past in any ordered way, no procession of memories or catalogue of old faces, but fragments rose and fell like bubbles in a simmering pot. The face of the old infirmarian who had taught her the uses of foxglove when she herself was young, a woman named Sister Winifred who had hands as gnarled as the roots of an ancient hawthorn. The smell of the still room in high summer when the lavender was being distilled and the whole convent seemed to breathe the sharp, clean scent. The sound of the night wind in the chimney of the infirmary, a low hooting that sometimes woke the patients and made them call out in their sleep. These things passed through her awareness and faded, leaving no trace, no residue of strong feeling. One thought that did surface, though she did not invite it, was a name. It was the name of a valley far to the north, a place she had never seen and would never see, where the families along the border lived in a different rhythm. A rhythm of raid and reprisal that had continued for so many generations that no one could remember its beginning. The name of the valley came to her because one of the travelling wool merchants had mentioned it the previous spring, standing in the convent yard with his laden mules, speaking of a cousin who had lost sheep to a night ride. The name was Liddesdale, and it meant nothing to her beyond the shape of the word. The border Reivers, as they were called, were a reality as distant as the weather in another country, something that happened to other people and left no mark on the green folds of this Welsh valley. The thought of them did not bring fear or concern, only a faint recognition that the world was large and held many kinds of lives, most of them unknown to her. A butterfly, small and brown with orange tips on its wings, landed on the stone beside her hand. She watched it open and close its wings in a slow rhythm, tasting the mineral surface of the stone with the tiny sensory hairs on its feet. The movement of the wings was hypnotic, a gentle fanning that caught the sun and showed the orange tips as bright as sparks. She did not move her hand, and the butterfly stayed for a long minute before lifting off and fluttering away toward the bracken on the upper slope, where a patch of bluebell flowers made a pool of deeper color in the green. The rest had stretched to fill the time it needed, and she made no attempt to measure it. When the flask was half empty, and the bread was a memory of crumbs on her tunic, which she gathered with a damp fingertip and ate, she let her gaze wander over the clearing one more time. The old wall ran its course. The foxgloves stood in their ordered wildness. The grass moved in the breeze, and everything was as it should be. She felt the sun on her face and the solid weight of the stone behind her, and there was no part of her that wished to be anywhere else. Yet the morning was moving on, and there were more leaves to gather in the upper part of the clearing, where the foxgloves grew taller and the shade from the bracken bank kept the ground slightly cooler. She did not have to gather more, having already taken enough for her immediate need, but it was her habit to gather a small surplus when the plants were generous, enough to fill the jar completely, and leave a reserve for the winter months, when the path to the clearing would be too muddy to walk. The work was not urgent, but it was waiting. She stoppered the flask, folded the scrap of linen that had held the bread, and tucked both back into the basket beside the wrapped knife. Then she braced her hands on her knees and rose to her feet, doing it slowly so that her joints would not protest. Feeling the slight stiffness in her hips that came from kneeling on the ground and the pleasant ache in her lower back that came from the morning's bending, her shadow had shortened on the grass, the sun now almost directly overhead, and the light in the clearing had lost its gold and become the clear, colorless light of midday. It was time to move to the upper glade. The upper part of the clearing lay a short distance up the slope, where the ground rose toward the bracken bank and the trees drew back to leave an open shelf of grass and wildflowers that caught the full light of the climbing sun. Sister Aelwen lifted the basket from its resting place against the wall, the wicker handle warm now from the morning's heat, and began to walk up the gentle incline with the slow measured tread that she used on all paths, whether long or short. The grass here was coarser, mixed with the stiff stems of last year's bracken that cracked softly under her sandals, and the soil was thinner, showing pale patches of the underlying stone where the turf had worn away. The foxgloves in this upper glade stood taller than those below, their flowering spikes rising almost to her shoulder in some places, and still holding their full complement of purple bells, not yet faded at the tips, as the lower ones sometimes were by the advancing season. She found a new spot to kneel, a flat area where the grass was short, and a single large stone made a convenient anchor for the basket. The linen cloth was still spread inside, and she smoothed it again before settling the basket in place. The view from here was different from the one by the wall, more open, looking out across the whole sweep of the side valley to where it joined the main valley, and the distant ridge rose blue-grey in the midday haze. She could see the thread of the stream glinting in its course, and the dark dots of the convent's sheep on the far slope, and she could see the roof of the convent itself, a smudge of darker grey among the trees that surrounded it. The sight was familiar and distant at once, like looking at a drawing of a place she knew. The foxgloves here were still in full flower, their tall spires rising in clusters of 3 and 4, and the bees were even more numerous than they had been by the wall. The air hummed with their industry, a low, continuous drone that seemed to come from everywhere at once, and she could see them moving from bell to bell, their bodies dusted with the pale pollen that the flowers offered so freely. The hum was not a single note, but a complex sound, made of many different wing speeds and body sizes, and it blended with the trickle of the stream below and the distant calling of the wood pigeon into a kind of silence, the silence of a place so full of small sounds that no one sound stood out. She knelt on the grass and began to work. The knife came out of its leather wrapping, the basket was positioned at her right hand, and the rhythm of the morning resumed as if it had never been interrupted. Reach, examine, cut, place. The basal leaves in this part of the clearing were slightly larger than those below, their rosettes spreading wider in the richer soil that collected at the foot of the bracken bank, and she had to use both hands to lift some of the larger leaves without tearing them. Her left hand would support the leaf from underneath, while her right hand guided the blade, and then both hands would carry the leaf to the basket where it would be laid flat among its companions. The pile in the basket grew steadily, the grey-green of the leaves now a thick soft layer that filled the wicker container more than halfway. As she worked, a sound began to accompany her movements, a low humming that was not the bees but something coming from her own throat. It was not a song, not a tune that could be named or repeated, but a formless wandering of notes that rose and fell with her breathing and asked nothing of her attention. She had done this for as long as she could remember, humming while she worked, and the sound was so much a part of her that she was hardly aware of it. The bees did not mind, and the wren that had returned to its gap in the wall did not fly away, and so the clearing was filled with the small human sound of her voice, blending with the larger hum of the insects, a quiet duet that no one but the valley could hear. A foxglove spike bowed slightly as a bee climbed into one of the lower bells, and she paused in her cutting to watch the flower sway back and forth with the insect's weight. The throat of each flower was a wide-open bell of a soft rose-purple shade, and its interior was a darker purple marked with spots of pure white arranged in a ring that guided the eye toward the dark center, a pattern of such delicate precision that it seemed to have been painted by a hand finer than any human hand could be. Inside the bell, the bee moved with a slow, drunken determination, its legs brushing the pollen-bearing anthers that clustered at the roof of the flower, and the sound of its buzzing was amplified by the bell's shape into a tiny resonant note. She watched until the bee backed out and flew away, and then she let her hand rest for a moment on the stem of the plant, feeling the slight roughness of the hairs that covered it, the living warmth of the sap rising through the stalk. In her herbal, the book that she had copied out in her own hand over many winters, there was a drawing of the foxglove flower done in fine ink and tinted with washes of colour made from the plants themselves. The drawing showed the flower opened out flat, so that the pattern of the spots could be seen clearly, and beside it was written the plant's name in Latin and in Welsh, and a list of its virtues and its dangers. She thought of that drawing now, the way the ink had flowed from her quill to create the curving lines of the bell, the way she had mixed the purple from elderberries and the white from chalk ground fine in the mortar. The book was on a shelf in the still room, its pages worn soft at the corners from many turnings, and it held the knowledge of all the plants that grew in the valley and on the hills, a knowledge that had been gathered by the sisters of the convent over many generations and would be passed on to the ones who came after. She spoke to the plant then a few words in Welsh that she had learned from the old women who had first taught her the uses of the herbs. The words were half-formed, a whisper that was almost a thought, thanking the plant for giving its leaves and promising to use them well. It was not a prayer, not a spell, but a simple acknowledgement from one living thing to another. The kind of courtesy that the valley seemed to expect from those who walked its paths and gathered its bounty. The plant swayed slightly in the breeze, and she released its stem and turned back to her work. The sun was now high enough that the shadow of her own head was a small dark circle on the grass beside her knee, and the warmth on her back was beginning to feel like a weight. She loosened the linen coif around her face, pushing it back slightly so that the air could reach her temples, and the breeze that came down from the bracken bank was cool on the skin that had been covered all morning. The grey-streaked hair that was usually hidden was now visible, fine and soft, and the breeze stirred it gently as she bent to her work again. She took another leaf, and the rhythm continued. The basket grew heavier, and she shifted it slightly on the grass to keep it from tipping. The leaves were now a deep, soft pile, their surfaces overlapping like the scales of a pine-cone, and she could smell the green scent of them, a smell like crushed nettles but fainter, with a slight sharpness at the back of the throat. It was the smell of the medicine they would become, the powder that she would grind fine in the stone mortar and mix with honey and wine, the small careful dose that would calm the racing heart of the old woman in the infirmary cot. The thought of that medicine passed through her mind as she worked, not as a goal or a duty, but simply as the next step in a process that she knew as well as she knew the path to the clearing. She worked her way across the upper glade, moving from plant to plant in a slow sideways progression, and when the sun told her that the morning had passed into full midday, she sat back on her heels and looked at the basket. It was nearly full now, the leaves stacked evenly and the linen cloth folded over the top layer to keep them from drying in the sun. The weight of it was satisfying, a solid heft that would make the return walk a little slower, but that was how it should be. The work was done, and the clearing had given what was needed. She wrapped the knife in its leather, tucked it into the side of the basket, and rose slowly to her feet. Her knees protested slightly, the small creak of the joints that she acknowledged with a quiet grunt, and she straightened her back with her hands pressed against the base of her spine. The view from the upper glade was still the same. The valley spread out below in its green folds, the convent a grey smudge on the hill, the stream a silver thread, and the sky a pale blue that had hazed over slightly as the day warmed. She stood for a moment, feeling the breeze on her face and the solid ground under her feet, and then she bent to lift the basket. The handle fit into the crook of her arm with the familiar pressure, and the basket swung gently against her hip as she took the first step back down toward the wall, toward the path, toward the long, slow walk that would carry her and her harvest back to the quiet infirmary where the patients slept, and the brazier glowed, and the green glass jar waited to be filled. The basket sat on the grass in the full light of midday, its wicker sides bulging slightly with the weight of the leaves within, and Sister Aelwen looked at it with the calm satisfaction of a task completed, not hurriedly, but thoroughly. The sun had reached its zenith, or nearly so, and the shadows in the clearing had shrunk to small, dark pools directly beneath the foxglove plants, pools that barely extended beyond the spread of the basal leaves themselves. The air was warm without being hot, the kind of warmth that the Welsh valleys held in late spring, tempered always by the moisture that rose from the stream and the breezes that wandered down from the higher hills. The bees were still at work, though their humming seemed to have settled into a lower register, as if the fullness of the day had mellowed even their industry. She knelt beside the basket and began the slow process of packing it for the walk home. The leaves, which she had laid flat one by one as she worked, now formed a thick layer of grey-green that nearly reached the basket's rim, and she could see that a few of them had curled slightly at the edges from the warmth of the sun. This would not do. The leaves needed to stay fresh and supple until she could wash them in the still room, and the walk back to the convent was long enough that the sun would draw the moisture from them if they were left uncovered. From the bottom of the basket she drew out a second square of linen, this one slightly larger than the cloth she had knelt upon, and she dipped it into the small rivulet that trickled along the base of the old wall, where a stone had been dislodged and the water had found a new course through the grass. The linen soaked up the cool water eagerly, darkening from cream to a soft grey, and she wrung it out with a gentle twist of her wrists so that it was damp but not dripping. The damp cloth she spread carefully over the top layer of leaves, tucking the edges down around the sides of the pile with a light touch that did not press or bruise the leaves beneath. The moisture would create a small cool atmosphere inside the basket, a miniature version of the morning dew that had kept the plants fresh before she arrived, and it would be enough to preserve the leaves until she reached the still room. She smoothed the cloth with her palm, feeling the slight chill of the damp linen and the springy resistance of the leaves beneath it, and then she folded the corner of the cloth under itself so that it would not flap loose on the walk. The knife came next, the small curved blade that she had used all morning and that now lay on the grass beside the basket, with its edge still faintly smeared with the green residue of the cut stems. She wiped the blade clean on a corner of the dry linen cloth, rubbing the steel with slow circular motions until the surface was bright and free of sap, and then she wrapped it in its leather sheath and tied the cord that held the sheath closed. The knife went into the basket, not on top of the leaves, but tucked into the gap between the wicker side and the linen cloth, where it would not shift or press against the harvest. The dry linen cloth she folded twice and laid over the damp one, creating a second layer of protection against the sun. The flask, now nearly empty with only a mouthful or two of ale sloshing in the bottom, she stoppered firmly and wedged beside the knife. The cork had swollen slightly from the moisture and required a firm push to seat it properly, and she did this with the heel of her palm, feeling the slight give of the cork and then the solid resistance as it sealed the neck of the flask. The wicker basket had a small loop of cord on one side, and she threaded the flask's neck through this loop so that it would not rattle against the knife on the walk down. With everything packed, she remained kneeling for a moment longer and surveyed the clearing. Her work here was done, but there was a final thing she always did before leaving a gathering place, a small ritual that had no name, but was as much a part of the harvest as the cutting of the leaves. She looked at the ground where she had worked, tracing with her eyes the patches of grass where she had knelt and the plants she had visited. checking to see that no scraps of cut stem or torn leaf had fallen to mark her passing. A single small leaf fragment lay on the grass near the wall, a triangle of grey-green that had fluttered free when she was trimming a stem, and she picked it up and tucked it into the basket with the others. The cut stems of the foxglove plants were clean and neat, the wounds already beginning to seal over with a thin film of dried sap, and the plants would recover from the harvest without any harm. She gathered up the linen cloth she had knelt on, shaking it once to free any clinging bits of grass or soil, and folded it into a square that she placed on top of the dry cloth in the basket. The ground where she had knelt looked no different from the ground around it, the grass perhaps a little flattened, but already springing back in the warmth of the sun. The clearing was as she had found it, the foxglove still standing tall, the bees still working, the old wall still curving in its gentle arc, and there was no sign that anyone had been there at all beyond the neat harvest that now rested in her basket. She rose to her feet then, doing it slowly as she always did, and the stiffness that had settled into her knees and the small of her back during the long morning of kneeling and bending made itself known. She straightened her spine by degrees, pressing her hands against her lower back and arching slightly, and the small aches that ran along her muscles were not unpleasant, merely the body's quiet accounting of the work it had done. Her shoulders, which had been rounded forward for so long, cracked softly when she rolled them back, and her neck released a tension she had not noticed, with a gentle stretch to one side and then the other. The breeze that came across the clearing was cool on her face, and she stood for a long moment simply being upright, feeling the ground solid under her feet and the sun warm on the crown of her head where the coif had slicked back slightly. The silence of the clearing was broken then by a sound that came from far away, a sound so faint at first that she was not certain she had heard it. She paused, her hand still on the small of her back, and listened. The sound came again, a thin, silvery note that seemed to float on the warm air like a leaf on still water, and she recognized it as the convent bell ringing for sext, the midday office. The bell was small, a single bronze bell that hung in the stone arch over the chapel door, and its voice was not loud, but it carried well across the valley when the air was still, as it was now. The sound reached her in the clearing as a series of 3 clear notes, a pause and then 3 more, the pattern repeating twice and then falling silent. The notes drifted across the fields and through the trees, losing their sharpness as they travelled and becoming something softer, almost a memory of a sound by the time they reached her ears. She stood listening until the last echo of the bell had faded, and then she nodded once to herself, a small acknowledgement that the day had moved on and the convent was calling its sisters to prayer. She would not be there for sext, having received permission from the infirmarian to spend the morning in the valley, but the sound of the bell was a marker, a reminder that the world beyond the clearing continued in its steady rhythm. The patients in the infirmary would be stirring by now, the lay sisters would be laying out the midday meal in the refectory, and the cantrix would be leading the small community in the psalms of the office. All of it was waiting for her return, and none of it was urgent. She lifted the basket from the ground, settling the handle into the crook of her arm and adjusting the weight so that it hung evenly. The basket was heavier now than it had been on the walk out, the leaves adding a solid poundage that pressed the wicker against her hip. But the weight was familiar, and she adjusted to it without thought, shifting the load slightly as she began to walk. Her first steps took her past the old wall, and she let her free hand brush against the stones as she passed, feeling the rough warmth of the lichen and the smooth coolness of the stone-crop leaves. A tactile farewell to the place that had sheltered her morning. The path back to the main valley began at the lower edge of the clearing, where the grass gave way to the sheep track that wound between the hazels, and she stepped onto it with the same careful tread she had used on the way up. The descent required a slightly different attention than the climb, the weight of the basket pulling her forward a little so that she had to lean back and brace her knees against the slope. She took the first downward stretch slowly, placing each foot with deliberation on the packed earth and avoiding the loose stones that might skid under her weight. The bracken brushed against her tunic as she passed, and the scent of it, green and sharp, rose in the midday warmth. The clearing fell behind her, and the trees closed in again, the hazel canopy dappling the path with shifting patterns of light and shadow that moved as the breeze stirred the leaves overhead. The sound of the bees faded, replaced by the nearer sound of the stream that ran along the valley floor, its voice growing louder as she descended, a steady rushing that was not hurried but constant. The shift-jaff was still calling its 2 notes, and the wood pigeon had not stopped its cooing, and the world was full of small noises that asked for nothing and gave everything. She walked on, the basket swaying gently with her steps, the knife and flask making a soft muted clink each time she shifted the weight from one arm to the other, and the bell for Sext was now only a memory, a faint vibration that had passed through the air and left no trace behind it. The slope was gentle, the sun was warm, and the afternoon lay ahead like a long, quiet road that led back to the cool stone rooms where the drying herbs hung from the rafters and the green glass jar waited to be filled. The descent began in earnest, where the sheep track met the edge of the clearing, the ground falling away at a gentle but steady angle that required her to lean back slightly, her sandals pressing into the packed earth with each step. The basket, which had been a manageable weight during the short walk across the level ground, now made itself known with a different insistence, its wicker handle pressing more deeply into the crook of her arm and its bulk swinging forward with the downward momentum of each stride. She shifted it to her left arm, then after a short distance back to her right, the load redistributing itself with each change, and she settled into a slower pace than the one she had used on the way up. There was no need to hurry, and the afternoon stretched before her as open and unhurried as the morning had been. The hazels closed overhead almost at once, their leaves catching the midday sun and scattering it into a shifting mosaic of light and shadow on the path. The air under the trees was noticeably cooler than the open air of the clearing, holding a green dimness that felt like stepping into a room with thick walls, and she was grateful for the shade after the long morning in the sun. The scent of the wood was different now than it had been at dawn. The sharp, fresh dampness of the early hours had given way to a warmer smell, a blend of dry earth and sun-warmed leaves, and the faint mushroom scent of the leaf mold that had been accumulating under the trees for countless autumns. A small fly buzzed past her ear, its sound a thin whine that rose and fell and then faded as it veered away into the undergrowth. Where the path leveled out briefly at the base of the first slope, she paused and set the basket down on a flat stone that jutted from the bank. The relief in her arm was immediate, a release of tension that she felt all the way up into her shoulder, and she flexed her fingers several times to restore the circulation that the basket handle had pressed away. She did not sit, but stood with her hands on her hips, breathing the cool air and looking back up the path toward the clearing that was now hidden from view by the curve of the hillside. A spider had spun its web between 2 hazel stems at the edge of the path, a perfect orb that glinted with silver threads, where the sun found it through a gap in the leaves, and in its center the spider sat motionless as a tiny bead of polished jet. She lifted the basket again and continued down. The path here ran closer to the small side stream, the same stream that trickled past the clearing, and she could hear its voice growing clearer as she descended, a soft glassy sound that ran over stones and around the exposed roots of the alders. The water was barely a handspan wide in places, but it was constant and bright, and where the sun reached it through the canopy, it sparkled with a light that was almost white. She watched it as she walked, her eyes following its course down the slope parallel to the path, and she felt the coolness that rose from it, a faint moisture in the air that settled on her cheeks like the lightest of mists. A little further down, the path crossed the stream at a shallow ford where someone long ago had placed a line of flat stepping stones across the water. The stones were dark with moisture and patched with moss on their downstream sides, and the water flowed between them with a quiet rippling sound that was deeper than the trickle above, a sound like small bells rung under a cloth. She crossed with care, the weight of the basket making her slightly less steady than usual, and she tested each stone with her toe before committing her full weight. The moss was slippery under her sandals, and she held her free arm out slightly for balance, a slow and deliberate passage that ended with her feet on the dry earth of the far bank without mishap. On the other side, the path widened and joined the main valley track, the same track she had followed down from the convent in the early morning. The junction was marked by the fallen oak log she had passed before, its moss still vivid green, and its bark still peeling in long strips that curled outward like the pages of an old book left too long in the damp. She touched the moss again as she passed, another light brush of her fingertips, and this time her fingers came away with a tiny fragment of the green carpet that she examined for a moment before letting it fall to the path. The moss was made of hundreds of tiny leaves, each one no larger than a grain of sand, and they overlapped one another in a pattern that was both random and perfectly ordered, like the stones in the old wall or the spots in the throat of a foxglove flower. The main valley track was broader and more level than the sheep path, and the walking was easier here, the ground packed hard by the passage of feet, and the occasional hoof of a donkey bringing wool down from the high pastures. She settled into a rhythm that matched the easy contour of the path, her sandals making a soft scuffing sound on the dry earth, her breathing slow and regular. The trees opened out in places to give glimpses of the valley below, the pattern of fields and walls, and the silver thread of the main stream. And in one of these openings she saw a herd of the convent sheep moving slowly across a distant pasture, their white shapes like small clouds that had come down to graze. It was at one of these open places that she stopped for a longer rest, setting the basket on a low stone that formed part of a boundary wall, and seating herself beside it on a patch of short turf that was warm from the sun. The flask, nearly empty, came out of the basket and she drank the last few mouthfuls of ale, tilting the flask to catch every drop, the liquid now barely cool, but still refreshing. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked out across the valley without any need to name what she saw. The fields, the stream, the distant ridge, the sky pale with the haze of afternoon. All of it was simply present, as it had been present every day of her life, in the convent, and it asked nothing of her but to be seen. The afternoon light had changed since she had left the clearing. The sun had moved past its zenith and begun its slow slide toward the western ridge, and the shadows that had been small and dark at midday were now lengthening, stretching out from the bases of the trees and the stones like dark water spilling slowly across the grass. The quality of the light had changed as well, the clear whiteness of noon giving way to a warmer tone, a faint golden cast that made the green of the fields seem deeper and the grey of the walls seem softer. It was the light of early afternoon, a light that invited stillness, and she accepted the invitation. A robin appeared on the wall a few feet away, its red breast vivid against the grey stone, and it regarded her with one bright black eye before bobbing its body in the characteristic motion of its kind. She remained still, and the robin hopped a little closer, its head cocked to one side, and then it flew down to the path in front of her feet, where it began to peck at something invisible in the dust. It stayed with her for the remainder of her rest, a small companion that asked for no food and offered no song, simply present in the same way that she was present. Two creatures sharing a patch of warm sun on an afternoon in the valley. When the rest was done and the flask was empty and the robin had flown away into the hazels, she rose and lifted the basket and resumed the walk. The path now followed the course of the main stream more closely, and she walked for a stretch beside the water, the sound of it a constant rush that was not loud but deep, made of many small movements over stone and around root. The water ran clear over its bed of grey pebbles, and she could see the shapes of small fish darting in the shallows, their shadows more visible than their bodies. Watercress grew thickly along the edge, the dark green of its leaves a contrast to the lighter green of the grass, and she noted with a part of her mind that she would need to gather some on another day, when the foxglove was dried and the infirmary did not need her immediate attention. The path curved away from the stream and began a gentle climb toward the shoulder of the hill where the convent stood. The final stretch of the walk was the most familiar to her, the path she had walked more times than she could count, and her feet knew every stone and every root. The trees began to thin as she climbed, giving way to the open slope of the hill with its short grass and its outcrops of grey rock, and she could see the convent wall above her, a solid line of stone that marked the boundary between the wild valley and the ordered life within. The wall was grey and old, patched with lichen and tufted with small ferns that grew in the crevices between the stones, and it was the most welcome sight she knew. The gate came into view, the same gate she had closed behind her in the early morning, when the mist was still in the hollows and the birds were just beginning to sing. She pushed it open with her free hand, the iron latch lifting easily, and stepped through into the cloister garden, where the herbs grew in neat rows and the roses climbed the south wall. The garden was warm with the stored heat of the day, and the scent of sage and lavender rose around her as her tunic brushed against the plants. A sister was there, kneeling by the chamomile bed, with a small weeding fork in her hand, and she looked up as Sister Aelwen passed and gave a quiet nod of greeting and recognition. No words were needed. The nod was enough. The heavy oak door of the infirmary stood before her, and she pushed it open with her shoulder, the wood swinging inward on its iron hinges with the same soft thud that had closed it behind her hours before. The cool dimness of the long room welcomed her, the scent of lavender and beeswax and clean linen enfolding her like a familiar garment, and the small glow of the brazier was still burning in its iron cradle. The patients in their cots had stirred since she had left, and some of them were awake now, their faces turning toward the door as she entered. The young lay sister Margaret was sitting up in her cot with a cup of broth in her hands, and the old woman Gwen was asleep, with her breathing still laboured but steady. Everything was as she had left it, and she carried the basket of leaves into the still room, the day's walk behind her and the day's work ahead. The still room door opened on silent hinges, the wood having been planed and fitted by a lay brother long ago who had taken particular care with this threshold, knowing that the herbalist would pass through it many times each day. Sister Aelwen stepped inside and let the door close behind her with a gentle click, the sound of the iron latch falling into its keep, more felt than heard. The room was cool, noticeably cooler than the cloister garden and the sun-warmed slope outside, its thick stone walls holding the night's chill well into the afternoon and keeping the temperature steady through all the seasons of the year. High on the north wall, a single window of oiled parchment let in a soft, diffuse light that fell without shadows, a grey-silver illumination that was kind to dried herbs and preserved their colours longer than direct sun ever could. The scent of the still room was the scent of the convent's long memory. Dried lavender hung in bundles from the rafters, its fragrance still potent after months of hanging, releasing a sweet, clean perfume that seemed to have soaked into the very stones. Beneath the lavender were other smells, layered like the pages of a book. The sharp green of dried rosemary, the musty sweetness of meadowsweet, the faint medicinal tang of wormwood, the honeyed warmth of dried chamomile flowers. And under all of these was the cool mineral smell of the stone itself, a smell like the inside of a cave or the depths of a well, clean and ancient and still. She breathed in these familiar layers as she crossed the threshold, and her shoulders, which had been slightly lifted against the weight of the basket, settled down into a deeper rest. The room was not large, perhaps 8 paces from the door to the far wall, and 6 paces across, but every surface had been used with the careful economy of a place where space was precious. Shelves of dark oak rose from floor to ceiling on 3 walls, each shelf crowded with pottery jars and glass bottles and small wooden boxes, each container labelled with a scrap of parchment written in her own careful script or in the hand of the infirmarian who had come before her. A long table of scrubbed oak stood in the centre of the room, its surface worn smooth by generations of hands and stained in places with the faint brown ghosts of long ago spills. Beside the table stood a smaller bench that held a deep basin of grey stone, and above the basin a lead pipe projected from the wall, its mouth shaped like a lion's head from whose lips the spring water flowed when a wooden tap was turned. The spring that fed the convent rose on the hill above the buildings and had been channeled into pipes by the same unknown hands that had built the old wall in the clearing, and its water was always cold, always clear, and always plentiful. Sister Aelwen set the basket on the wide oak table and stood for a moment letting her arms rest, the pleasant ache of the long walk still humming in her muscles. She removed her sandals at the door, as she always did in the still room, and the stone floor was cold and smooth under her bare feet, the chill rising through her soles and somehow making the rest of her body feel warmer by contrast. The linen coif she pushed back from her forehead, and then, after a pause of consideration, she untied it entirely and laid it on the corner of the bench where it would stay clean and dry. Her grey-streaked hair, released from its confinement, fell softly around her face, and she smoothed it back with both hands in a gesture that was automatic and without vanity. The first task was to empty the basket and examine each leaf. She lifted off the folded linen cloths that had protected the harvest on the walk, setting them aside on the bench, and the grey-green leaves were revealed beneath, still fresh and cool from the damp cloth she had laid over them. She reached into the basket with both hands and lifted the entire pile, a soft crackling mass that weighed surprisingly little for its bulk, and laid it on the table. The leaves spread out across the scrubbed oak like a fan of silver and sage, their surfaces covered with the fine soft down that gave them their characteristic sheen, and she began the slow work of sorting them. Each leaf was lifted, held close to her eyes, and turned slowly in the light from the high window to reveal any flaw that might have escaped her notice in the clearing. She was looking for the small brown spots that indicated the beginning of rot, the ragged edges where a slug had fed in the night before she arrived, the tiny pinprick holes where an insect had laid its eggs beneath the surface of the leaf. Most of the leaves were perfect, and these she placed in a neat pile on the left side of the table, smoothing each one flat with a gentle stroke of her palm before adding the next. A few were not perfect. One leaf, the largest of the batch, had a tear near its base where her knife had slipped slightly on the tough stem, and she set it aside in a smaller pile that would be dried anyway and used for a weaker infusion. Another leaf showed the pale tracks of a leaf miner, tiny winding paths eaten through the inner layers of the leaf, and this one she discarded entirely into a small basket on the floor that collected scraps for the compost heap behind the kitchen garden. A third leaf had a patch of rust-colored fungus on its underside, and it joined the first in the compost basket. The sorting was slow, her hands moving through the leaves with the patient attention that she gave to all her work, and the piles on the table grew and shifted as the minutes passed. When the last leaf had been examined and placed in its proper pile, she paused and rolled her shoulders, feeling the slight stiffness that had crept into her neck from bending over the table. The good pile was large and healthy, containing the great majority of the morning's harvest, and the discard pile was small. It had been a successful gathering, the clearing offering its best leaves without stinginess, and she felt the quiet satisfaction that came from a task done well. She gathered the discard leaves and carried them to the door, stepping out briefly into the cloister garden to drop them into the wooden compost bin that stood against the north wall, where they would decay among the kitchen scraps and the pulled weeds, and eventually return to the soil as a rich dark earth that would feed next year's herbs. The circle was complete, the leaves returning to the ground that had grown them, and she closed the bin's lid with care before going back inside. The good leaves waited on the table, their grey-green surfaces catching the soft light, and now it was time to wash them. She turned to the stone basin and opened the wooden tap, the carved lion's head releasing a stream of water that splashed into the basin with a sound like a small waterfall, muted by distance. The water was so cold that it made her fingers ache pleasantly when she held them under the flow, and she let it run until the basin was half full and the water had cleared of the initial cloudiness that sometimes came after the pipes had been still for a while. Then she closed the tap and the sound of running water stopped, leaving only the faint drip of a single drop from the lion's stone lip. She lifted the good leaves in a single large handful and slid them into the basin, where they floated on the surface of the cold water like a fleet of small grey-green boats. The water darkened slightly as the dust of the path and the tiny particles of soil lifted from the leaves and drifted down toward the bottom of the basin. She worked with both hands, taking each leaf between her thumb and forefinger and rubbing it gently under the water, feeling the downy surface grow slick under her touch as the dirt released. The motion was not scrubbing, which would bruise the tender leaves, but a light caressing stroke that moved from the base of the leaf to its tip and back again, repeated once or twice until the leaf was clean. The cold water numbed her fingers slightly after a while, turning her knuckles pink and making her joints feel stiff. But the sensation was not unpleasant, merely another of the small physical experiences that accompanied the work. Each clean leaf was lifted from the basin with a gentle shake that sent a scatter of droplets back onto the water's surface and laid on the clean linen towels that she had spread across the table in preparation. The towels were the same undyed linen as her shift, woven by the sisters in the weaving room and washed so many times that the fibers were soft as worn silk. She laid the leaves flat on the towels, none overlapping, and when one towel was full she spread another beside it and continued the work. The rhythm of the washing was steady and slow, a repetition of small motions that matched the rhythm of her breathing, and the still room was quiet except for the soft plash of the water and the faint rustle of the leaves as she moved them. When the last leaf was clean and laid on its towel, she emptied the basin by pulling a wooden plug from its base, and the water drained away through a channel cut in the stone floor that led out to the garden, where it would water the roots of the chamomile and the sage. Then she took up a dry corner of the linen towel and began the final part of the cleaning process, patting each leaf dry. This was even slower work than the washing, requiring a light touch that absorbed the surface moisture without crushing the leaf's delicate structure. She worked her way across the table, leaf by leaf, the towel in her hand pressing and lifting in small dabbing motions that left the leaf surface clean and only slightly damp to the touch. The process could not be rushed, and she did not try to rush it. The leaves would need to be completely dry on their surfaces before they went to the drying loft, or the moisture would cause them to mold in the warmth, and all her work would be wasted. She was perhaps halfway through the drying when the door opened and a figure appeared in the doorway. It was the infirmarian, Sister Gwyneth, a woman of middle years with a calm square face and hands that were reddened from much washing of patients and linens. She did not enter fully, but stood in the doorway with one hand on the frame, her presence quiet and unhurried. She had come to speak of a patient, the old woman Gwen, whose breathing had been more labored than usual during the night, but her voice was low and slow, the words spaced out with pauses that acknowledged the stillness of the still room and the peace of the work being done there. Sister Aelwen listened while her hands continued their gentle dabbing, and she answered in the same low tone, reporting that the foxglove had been gathered and would be dried in the loft above the kitchen, and that the new tonic would be ready before compline. The infirmarian nodded, her question answered, and lingered for a moment looking at the leaves spread out on the towels, their grey-green surfaces now clean and gleaming with a faint sheen of moisture. Then she withdrew as quietly as she had come, pulling the door close behind her with a soft click. The interruption passed like a ripple on still water, leaving no disturbance behind it. Sister Aelwen returned her full attention to the leaves, and the quiet rhythm of the drying continued. The light from the high window had shifted slightly, the angle of the sun moving westward and sending the beam of grey-silver light further across the table toward the wall, and the dust motes that floated in the beam drifted slowly like tiny seeds caught in an invisible current. The smell of the room was the same as it had been when she entered, lavender and rosemary and clean wet stone, and the cool air pressed gently against her bare feet and her uncovered hair. The leaves were nearly dry, and soon they would be ready for the loft. The door of the still room closed behind her with the familiar soft click, and Sister Aelwen stood for a moment in the narrow passageway that led to the kitchen stairs, the clean linen towel folded over her arm and a basket of damp leaves held carefully against her chest. The passageway was dim, its only light coming from a small window set high in the wall that looked out onto the kitchen garden, and the air here was warmer than the still room, carrying the first faint breath of the great hearth that burned day and night in the kitchen below. She had put her sandals on again for the walk to the drying loft, the leather soles making a soft sound on the worn flagstones as she moved, a sound that was half a shuffle and half a step, the gait of someone who was in no hurry and whose feet knew every dip and hollow of the floor. The stairway to the drying loft was tucked into the corner where the kitchen wing met the main body of the convent, a narrow spiral of stone steps that wound upward in a tight curve, each step worn into a shallow hollow by the passage of countless feet over the years. The steps were uneven in height, some slightly taller and others slightly shorter, the work of masons who had fitted the stones together without the aid of precise measure, and the wall beside them was cool and dark, the stones rough under her palm as she climbed. A rope ran along the wall as a handhold, its fibers polished smooth by the grip of many hands, and she trailed her fingers along it as she ascended, the rope guiding her upward through the dimness. The scent of the kitchen grew stronger with each step, the smell of wood smoke and rising bread, and the faint sharp tang of the soft cheese that the kitchen sisters made each week from the milk of the convent's few goats. The loft opened out at the top of the stairs, a long low room that ran the full length of the kitchen wing and was lit by a single dormer window at the far end that faced westward to catch the afternoon sun. The window was small and set deep into the thick stone wall, and the light that came through it was warm and golden at this hour, the sun having moved well into the western sky and pouring its rays directly through the oiled parchment. The rest of the loft was dim, the corners retreating into a soft brown shadow where the roof beams came down to meet the floor, and the air was dry and warm, heated by the great hearth below whose massive chimney rose through the center of the loft and radiated a steady, gentle warmth that never fully faded, even on the coldest nights. The rafters were crowded with bundles of drying herbs, their stems tied with loops of twine and hung upside down in thick clusters that swayed slightly in the warm air that rose from the kitchen. Thyme and sage and meadowsweet and yarrow, some still green and some already faded to the softer colors of preservation, their scents mingling in the warm air to create a fragrance that was both complex and comforting. The thyme was sharp and slightly resinous. The sage was soft and dusty. The meadowsweet carried a hint of almond that made the air seem almost sweet, and the yarrow had a dry herbal smell that spoke of summer fields and long, slow afternoons. A few bundles of lavender hung near the window where the light would catch them. Their purple flowers now faded to a silvery grey, but their scent still potent, and among them were smaller bundles of chamomile and lemon balm and the pale green fronds of fennel. Beneath the hanging herbs, a series of wicker trays stood on wooden racks that had been built along the walls, their surfaces covered with squares of fine muslin that were clean and white and stretched smooth. These were the drying trays, where leaves and flowers and roots were laid to cure slowly in the steady warmth, and some of them were already occupied. A tray near the door held the pale green leaves of lemon balm spread thinly so that no leaf touched another, their edges just beginning to curl upward as the moisture left them. Another tray held chamomile flowers that had been gathered the previous week, their yellow centers now darkening to brown, and their white petals shrinking into thin, papery curls. A third tray held slices of angelica root, pale and fibrous, their edges translucent in the light from the window. Sister Aelwen crossed to an empty rack near the center of the loft, where the warmth from the chimney was steady but not intense, and she set her basket down on the floor beside it. The tray that waited there was clean and empty, its muslin cover fresh and white, and she lifted it down from the rack and placed it on a small work table that stood beneath the window. The table was rough, its surface marked with the small nicks and stains of long use, and it caught the afternoon light in a pool of gold that made the wood seem almost warm to the touch. She spread her linen towel beside the tray and began the slow work of transferring the leaves from the basket to the drying surface. Each leaf was lifted separately, her thumb and forefinger gripping the stem where she had cut it in the clearing, and laid on the muslin with a care that was almost ceremonial. The leaves were still slightly damp from their washing, their surfaces cool and clean and faintly shining, and she positioned each one with its underside facing up so that the moisture trapped in the fine hairs of the surface would evaporate more quickly. The leaves were arranged in rows, each leaf a small distance from its neighbors so that the air could circulate freely around them, and the rows were straight but not rigid, following the slight curve of the wicker tray like the lines of a field contouring the slope of a hill. The work was slow and demanded her full attention. The leaves varied in size, some as broad as her outspread hand, and others no larger than her palm, and each one required its own space, its own small patch of muslin where it could dry undisturbed. She adjusted and readjusted the positions of the leaves as she worked, moving a leaf slightly to the left or slightly to the right to give its neighbor more room, smoothing the muslin beneath each leaf with a light stroke of her finger, ensuring that no fold or wrinkle would create a pocket of trapped moisture. The dormer window cast its golden light across her hands as she worked, and the dust motes that floated in the beam moved slowly, their paths a gentle spiral that rose and fell with the unseen currents of warm air that breathed through the loft. When the tray was full, its surface covered with a single even layer of grey-green leaves, she paused and straightened her back. The leaves lay in their ordered rows, and the muslin showed between them in a grid of white lines that crossed like the threads of a woven cloth. She counted the leaves without meaning to, her eye moving across the rows and adding up the numbers as automatically as breathing. There were 43 leaves in this tray, the best of the morning's harvest, and they would dry slowly over the course of the next fortnight, their green fading to a soft silver grey, and their moisture evaporating into the warm air until they were as brittle as old parchment and ready to be crumbled into the stone mortar. But the work was not yet finished. She returned to the basket and found more leaves waiting, enough to fill a second tray, and she fetched it from the rack and began the process again. The light from the window shifted slightly as the afternoon wore on, the golden beam moving across the table and climbing the far wall, and she worked in the quiet warmth with the scent of the drying herbs all around her. A scent that was the concentrated essence of the valley and the convent and all the years of her life within these walls. While the second tray filled, she paused from time to time to check the progress of the other herbs that were drying in the loft. She moved among the racks with the slow, careful step of someone who knew the space intimately, touching a leaf of lemon balm to test its crispness, turning a chamomile flower over to examine its center, lifting a slice of angelica root to her nose to smell its sweet, earthy fragrance. The lemon balm was nearly ready to be jarred, its leaves brittle enough to crackle when she pressed them between her fingers, and she made a mental note to come back the next day with a clean pottery jar. The chamomile needed a few more days, its yellow center still slightly soft, and the angelica was barely half cured, its fibers still flexible and pale. All of it was progressing as it should, the steady warmth of the loft doing its quiet work, and she returned to her tray with the calm certainty that nothing had been neglected. The second tray filled slowly, leaf by leaf, row by row, and when it was full she slid it onto the rack beside the first and stood back to survey her work. The two trays sat side by side, their grey-green surfaces a quiet testimony to the morning in the clearing and the long walk and the careful washing and the patient arranging. The leaves would dry well here, she knew, protected from the direct sun, but warmed by the steady heat of the kitchen chimney, and in a fortnight they would be ready to be crumbled and pounded in the stone mortar. With a heavy pestle whose handle was worn to the shape of her grip, she gathered the empty basket and the damp towels and the wrapped knife, and she took one last look around the loft before descending. The sun had moved further westward, and the light through the dormer window had deepened from gold to a rich amber that made the wooden racks blow, and the hanging herbs cast long shadows across the floor. The dust motes still drifted, the warmth still rose from the chimney, and the bundles of thyme and sage and meadowsweet still swayed with a movement so slight it was almost imperceptible, a breathing of the loft itself. Everything was in its place, everything was as it should be, and she turned toward the narrow stair with the basket in her hand and the towels over her arm, ready to descend back into the cool stone rooms below where the evening was waiting. The afternoon had faded into early evening by the time Sister Aelwen descended the narrow stair from the drying loft, her empty basket over her arm and the linen towels folded neatly against her hip. The kitchen below was quiet now, the great hearth burned down to a bed of glowing coals that the kitchen sisters would rake and cover before retiring, and the air in the passageway was warm with the residual heat of the day's baking. A single rushlight burned in a wall sconce near the kitchen door, its small flame steady in the still air, and it cast a soft orange glow that rippled across the stone flags like water over a shallow ford. She passed through the light and into the darker corridor beyond, her bare feet silent on the worn stones, and made her way back toward the still room to return her tools to their proper places. The basket went back onto its hook in the alcove. The knife was unwrapped and wiped once more with an oiled cloth before being laid in its wooden tray, and the linen towels were dropped into the basket of soiled cloths that the lay sisters would collect for washing on the morrow. The still room was dim now, the high window showing only a pale grey square of fading light, and she did not linger there. The evening was coming on, and the infirmary would need her presence for the final tasks of the day. In the long low room where the patients lay, the quality of the light had changed as well. The small windows set high in the walls showed a sky that was deepening from pale grey to a soft dusky blue, and the shadows that had been gathering in the corners all afternoon were now spreading out across the floor like slow dark water. The iron brazier had been replenished by one of the lay sisters, and its glow was brighter now, a warm red heart in the centre of the room that pushed back the evening chill and cast dancing shadows on the whitewashed walls. The air smelled of the charcoal and the lavender and the faint clean scent of the rushes that had been strewn on the floor that morning. The patients had settled for the night, or were beginning to. The young lay sister Margaret was asleep already, her cough much improved and her breathing deep and even, her face slack with the healthy rest of youth recovering its strength. Brother Cadfan was propped up against his pillow, his old eyes open and fixed on the ceiling, humming his tuneless drone that was so soft it was barely audible, a sound like the distant murmur of bees. The middle-aged sister with the swollen legs was knitting something in the dim light, her needles making a soft clicking that was as regular as a heartbeat, and the merchant's wife was eating a bowl of broth that a lay sister had brought her, spooning it slowly with a hand that still trembled slightly from her recent illness. And in the cot nearest the brazier, the old woman Gwen lay as she had lain all day, her breathing a soft rasp, her eyes closed, her thin hands folded on the blanket that covered her narrow chest. Sister Aelwen moved among them as she always did, stopping at each cot to speak a quiet word, or lay a hand on a forehead, or simply to let her presence be known. A patient in the long room was never alone for long, and the constant, gentle passing of the sisters was as much a medicine as any herbal powder. She straightened a blanket here, smoothed the pillow there, and her movements were so familiar to the patients that they barely registered her presence beyond a quiet comfort that settled over them like an extra covering on a cold night. At the cupboard at the far end of the room she stopped and opened the carved oak doors, the same doors she had opened in the darkness before dawn, when the valley was still covered in mist, and the foxgloves were still standing untouched in their clearing. The green glass jar was where she had left it, its meagre layer of last year's leaves still clinging to the bottom, and she lifted it down with both hands and carried it to the small work table that stood near the brazier. The light here was better, the glow of the coals casting enough illumination for the fine work that came next, and she set the jar on the table and began to gather what she needed. From the shelves above the table, she took down the heavy stone mortar, its interior worn smooth by years of grinding, and the pestle whose wooden handle was dark with the oils of her hand. She took down the small brass scale with its tiny weights, each one no larger than a thumbnail, and she polished the pans with a corner of her sleeve until they shone dully in the firelight. From a pottery crock she took a small pot of honey, thick and golden, the last of the autumn harvest from the convent's own hives, and from a stoppered bottle she poured a small measure of the elderberry wine that the kitchen sisters made each autumn and stored in the cool cellar beneath the still room. The wine was dark red and smelled of summer berries and the faint sharpness of fermentation. The old foxglove leaves in the green glass jar were so dry that they crumbled at the slightest touch, their grey-green long since faded to a pale silvery brown, their texture like the thinnest of ancient parchments. She lifted a small handful with care and placed them in the mortar, the leaves crackling softly as they settled, and then she took up the pestle and began to grind. The motion was circular and steady, the heavy stone head of the pestle crushing the leaves against the stone bowl in a rhythm that was as old as medicine itself. The leaves broke down quickly, their brittle structure yielding to the pressure, and soon they were reduced to a coarse powder that shifted with a soft rustle each time she tilted the mortar. She ground on, the pestle moving in its circles, until the powder was as fine as flour, so fine that it clung to the sides of the mortar and rose in a faint green-silver dust when she breathed too close. The brass scale she set to measure the powder, placing the tiny weights on one pan and spooning the ground foxglove onto the other, with a small bone spoon that had been carved for this purpose alone. The powder was so light and fine that a full spoonful weighed almost nothing, and she added and subtracted with a careful patience, tapping the spoon against the rim of the mortar to shake off the excess until the pans balanced perfectly and the scale's needle pointed true. The dose was small, no larger than a pinch of salt, and the difference between the dose that would steady a faltering heart and the dose that would bring harm was a margin so fine that it required this exacting care. She had measured this dose hundreds of times before, and yet she measured it each time as if it were the first, with the same attention and the same quiet respect for the power that the small grey leaves contained. The measured powder she tipped into a small pottery cup, and to it she added a spoonful of honey from the crock. The honey was thick and slow, its golden colour catching the firelight, and it pooled around the grey powder and then slowly absorbed it as she stirred with the thin end of a wooden spoon. The mixture became a smooth paste, the honey sweetness mellowing the sharp herbal scent of the foxglove, and then she added a few drops of the elderberry wine, stirring until the paste thinned into a syrup that could be spooned easily into a patient's mouth. The wine gave the mixture a slight sharpness that cut through the honey's cloying weight, and the final syrup was a deep amber colour with a faint greenish undertone. The cup in her hand, she crossed to the cot where the old woman Gwen lay breathing her slow laboured breaths. The woman's face was pale in the dim light, her closed eyes sunken in their sockets, her lips slightly blue at the edges as the heart within her chest struggled to push the blood through her tired veins. Sister Aelwen sat on the low stool that was always kept beside this cot, a stool that had been placed there for her by a lay sister who knew her habits, and she reached out to touch the old woman's shoulder with a light pressure. Gwen stirred at the touch, her eyes opening slowly, the clouded pupils searching the dim air for a long moment before finding the face of the herbalist above her. No words passed between them, for none were needed. Gwen knew this ritual as well as Sister Aelwen knew it, the nightly dose of the bitter syrup that would ease her breathing and let her sleep, without the terrible sensation of drowning in her own bed. She opened her mouth slightly, and Sister Aelwen spooned the syrup onto her tongue, a small careful motion that did not spill a single drop. The old woman swallowed, her throat moving with effort, and a faint grimace crossed her face at the bitterness that the honey and wine could mask, but not entirely hide. Sister Aelwen lifted the cup of watered ale from the small table beside the cot, and held it to the old woman's lips, and Gwen drank, washing away the taste. Then her head sank back onto the pillow, and her eyes closed again, and within a dozen slow breaths, the quality of her breathing had changed, the rattle fading and the rhythm steadying into something easier, something that would carry her through the night in comfort. Sister Aelwen remained on the stool for a while longer, watching the old woman's face in the dim light, listening to the easing of her breath. The tonic was doing its work, as it had done every night, and the small grey powder that had been the green leaves in the clearing that morning was now flowing through the old woman's blood, steadying the tired heart and bringing rest. There was no sense of miracle in this, no feeling of triumph, only the quiet satisfaction of a process completed, a cycle turned, a task done with care. The bell for Compline rang as she sat there, the same small bronze bell in the stone arch over the chapel door, its 3 clear notes drifting through the evening air and reaching her faintly through the thick walls of the infirmary. The sound was the signal for the final office of the day, the prayers that would close the convent's waking hours and commit the community to the peace of the night, and she heard it with the same quiet acknowledgment she had given the bell for 6 hours before. She did not rise to attend, for her place was here in the infirmary during the night hours, but she folded her hands in her lap and let the familiar words of the office pass through her mind in a quiet stream, the psalms and the prayers settling into her thoughts like seeds falling on turned soil. When the office was done and the distant murmur of the sisters' voices had faded into the deeper silence of the night, she rose from the stool and began her final round of the infirmary. The brazier would need more charcoal before the long hours of darkness, and she added it with the iron tongs, the coals shifting and sparking and then settling into a steady glow. The rushlights in their sconces on the walls were burning low, and she pinched out all but one, the last light left to burn near the door, so that any patient who woke in the night would not be in total darkness. The windows she checked, the shutters pulled closed against the night air, but not latched, leaving a small gap at the top where the stars would be visible from certain angles. The knitting lay sister had fallen asleep with her needles still in her hands, and Sister Aelwen gently removed them and set them on the bedside table, covering the sister's hands with the edge of her blanket. Brother Cadfan had stopped humming and fallen into a sleep that was so still it might have been death, but the faint rise and fall of his chest reassured her, and she moved on. The merchant's wife was snoring softly, her bowl of broth empty and pushed to one side, and Sister Aelwen lifted it to return to the kitchen in the morning. Margaret the young lay sister had curled onto her side, her breathing clear, and the old woman Gwen was sleeping the deep easy sleep of the medicine's mercy, her face peaceful and her lips no longer edged with blue. The last thing she did was to open the door of the infirmary and step out into the cloister garden for a moment, the cool night air washing over her face and hands. The stars were out in their multitudes, a great river of light that flowed across the sky from ridge to ridge, and the dark shapes of the hills rose against the deeper dark of the sky like the backs of sleeping animals. The Foxglove clearing was out there somewhere, invisible in the darkness, its purple spires now folded in shadow and its basal leaves, those she had not taken, still spreading in their quiet rosettes on the grass. A faint breeze stirred the lavender in the garden, releasing its fragrance into the night, and somewhere in the valley a fox barked, a single sharp cry that faded into the rush of the stream. She stood there for only a short while, long enough to feel the day's work settle into her bones, and the quiet of the night fill her mind. And then she stepped back inside and closed the door with the same soft thud that had begun the day. Her cell was waiting, the narrow pallet with its wool blanket and its straw pillow, and she lay down at last with the familiar creak of the rope netting under her weight and the rough warmth of the wool pulled up to her chin. The last thought that passed through her mind before the slow tide of sleep rose up to claim her was not a thought at all, but an image: the foxgloves in their clearing, the bees working the bells, and the sun warm on the old grey wall. Then the image faded, and there was only the darkness and the quiet, and the long, slow breathing of the night.